There is a particular kind of silence that only exists inside a bakery after the morning rush. The ovens still warm, the cases still full, the hum of the refrigeration units moving beneath everything like a slow, steady breath. That was where I was standing the first time the phone rang, not the store line, mine. I looked at the screen, an unknown number, but not truly unknown. There are some numbers your body recognizes before your mind catches up, some area codes that live in the chest, not the memory. I set the phone face down on the stainless steel counter and kept working. I had invoices to sign, a delivery to confirm, a new hire starting Thursday who needed her schedule by end of day. Ordinary things. The architecture of a life I had built with very deliberate hands. The phone lit up again, then again. By the fifth call, my hands had developed a faint tremor I hadn't felt in years. Not from fear exactly, from recognition. The body remembers what the mind has learned to file away neatly. I finished frosting the tray in front of me, one slow, even stroke at a time, because here is what I understood, standing in that kitchen at 32 years old, with 8 locations and a staff of 43, and a life that magazines had recently decided was worth photographing. Whoever was calling had not called when it mattered. They had not called when I was 8 years old, sitting in a room that smelled like bleach and institutional fabric softener, wearing shoes I kept on past bedtime because I thought someone might still come. They had not called on my 9th birthday, which passed without a card, without a voice, without a single proof that I existed in anyone's mind as something other than a problem that had been quietly relocated. They had not called when I aged out of the system at 18, with one duffel bag and a folder full of paperwork that nobody had properly explained to me. They called now, after a television interview aired, after a newspaper ran a piece with the word abandon printed in clear, unretouched type. After the silence I had lived inside for over 2 decades had finally, publicly, been given its correct name. I let it ring. 30 minutes passed. The phone went quiet. I stood in the stillness of my own kitchen, flour on my apron, payroll open on the laptop, tomorrow's dough already cold fermenting in the walk-in, and I thought about what it means to make people wait. They had always assumed I would be there when they were ready. For the first time in my life, I had no intention of proving them right. Before I tell you what happened when I finally opened that door, you need to understand what was behind it. Not the version people prefer, the clean one, the one where hard times explain everything and love was always present, just poorly expressed. The true one. We lived in Tucson, Arizona, in a 1-story house with a cracked driveway and a lemon tree that never gave quite enough fruit. My mother, Marlene, taught at an elementary school. My father, Daniel, managed shipping at a warehouse on the edge of town. My older brother, Owen, was the kind of child adults called easy. My younger sister, Chloe, was all curls and questions, and I was the one in the middle, old enough to notice things, young enough to still believe that noticing them might change something. For a while, home felt safe. Not perfect, but safe. Then my father lost his job. He said it was temporary. Then he said the company had restructured. Then he stopped saying much at all. My mother picked up extra hours. The air in the house changed in the way air only changes when adults are afraid and pretending they aren't. Bills appeared on the counter. Arguments that had once been whispered moved into full volume. Doors closed harder. Silences lasted longer. You always know when adults are lying about things being fine. They smile too quickly. They ask too many questions about school. They stop meeting your eyes. I listened through walls. I listened at the top of the stairs. I listened because no one was telling me the truth, and I had already learned, the way children in unstable homes always learn, that the truth tends to have your name somewhere inside it. The night I understood how serious things had become, I heard my mother say, "We cannot keep living like this." My father said, "Then leave." The silence that followed was not calm. It was the kind that tells you something permanent has just entered a room and does not plan to leave. A week later, they sat the three of us at the kitchen table and explained, in careful, rehearsed voices, that the family was going to change shape, that both of them loved us, that this was not our fault. Then real life pushed through the edges of the speech. My mother wanted Owen. He was organized, calm, easier to move through disruption with. My father wanted Chloe. She had cried for him, and he said she needed stability. Nobody said my name first. Nobody asked what I needed. Nobody looked at me and said, "And, Sienna?" I heard the rest of it later, through the bedroom door. "You take her," my mother's voice, tight and exhausted. "I can barely manage one. She's too emotional." My father. Then the sentence I carried for years beneath my skin, quiet and precise as a splinter. "Just for a little while. Maybe Hope House can keep her until we get settled." 2 days later, my mother packed my clothes into a small suitcase without folding them properly. My father drove. They called it temporary. They called it a few weeks. They called it the best thing for everyone. Hope House sat behind a chain-link fence with a faded sign. A woman at the front desk smiled at me in that careful way adults do when they know something terrible is happening and want credit for being gentle about it. My mother fixed my collar, even though nothing was wrong with it. My father signed papers without looking up. "Be good, okay? It'll just be for a little while." I remember waiting for one face to crack, for one voice to break, for someone to decide this was insane and take me back to the car. Instead, they stood up, they walked out, they did not turn around. They did not come back that weekend, or the next one, or the one after that. They did not come back for my birthday. They did not come back at all. They simply built new lives. My mother across town with Owen, my father at a friend's place with Chloe, and arranged those lives neatly around my absence. My caseworker, Miss Bell, left messages. She mailed forms. She told me my parents were working through a lot. What she did not say, but what I eventually understood from the change in language around me, from "when your family comes back" to "if there are updates," was that non-responsive was the professional word for what they had chosen to become. I learned the routines quickly because routines were safer than feelings. Wake up, make the bed, keep your tray straight. Don't ask too many questions. Don't cry where the older kids can see you. One girl asked me on my 4th day, "Did they say they were coming back?" I nodded. She shrugged. "They always say that." Then she walked away as though she had just handed me a fact and not a blade. The week my 9th birthday passed without a card, without a cake, without a single word from home, something shifted in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, internal closing of a door I had been holding open for months. I stopped sitting by the window, but I did not stop remembering exactly what it had felt like to sit there. That memory, I understood even then, was not something I should rush to release. It was something I should hold carefully until the moment it became useful. There is a specific kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. It is the hunger for proof. Proof that you are capable. Proof that you are not what your circumstances suggest. Proof that the people who decided you were too complicated to keep were, quietly, privately, permanently wrong. I did not have a word for that hunger when I was 10 or 12 or 15. I only knew that it lived somewhere behind my sternum and that it sharpened every time someone treated me like a temporary arrangement. Foster care did not look like the version people imagine when they want to feel better about the system. It looked like trash bags used as luggage. It looked like fold-out couches in dens with no doors. It looked like changing school so often that I stopped bothering to learn where the bathrooms were in the first week, because the first week was never safe to assume anything about. The families were not monsters. That almost made it harder. Monsters are easier to name. What I encountered instead was a particular brand of indifference, the kind that wears the face of responsibility while making you feel like a line item in someone else's budget. One woman was different, not kinder, precisely the opposite. She baked casseroles for church drives and called every child sweetheart in public. In private, she was surgical. She knew exactly where to press. Maybe if you were easier to love, somebody would have kept you. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had identified the wound with clinical accuracy and returned to it with consistency. I survived her the way I had survived everything else by then, by becoming useful. Useful children attract less attention. Useful children are harder to move without disruption. Useful children learn to make themselves indispensable in quiet, unremarkable ways. I cleaned, I folded, I helped younger children with their shoes and their homework and the order of the cafeteria line. I swallowed every question that sounded too much like a wound, but I was paying attention the entire time. The thing that changed the direction of everything did not announce itself as significant. It rarely does. A church meal program, Saturday mornings. I was sent to help because I was considered responsible, and because, in the foster system, reliability in a child tends to be rewarded with more responsibility rather than more rest. The man who ran the baking station was named Ramon Ellis. Everyone called him chef, even when he wasn't in a professional kitchen. He had flour on his shirt more often than not, and a voice that made instructions feel like something you could trust. He showed me how to level flour with the back of a knife, how yeast needed warm water, not hot, that there was a precise temperature at which living things would wake up, and exceeding it by even a little would kill them entirely. How dough changed when you gave it time instead of force. The first time I pulled a tray of dinner rolls from the oven, I stood very still and looked at them. They had risen because of what I had done. They had transformed because I had followed every step and stayed patient long enough for the change to happen. That may sound unremarkable to someone who grew up in a home where they were taught things. To me, it felt like discovering a law of the universe that no one had told me applied to my life too. Consistency produced results. Attention was rewarded. Care, real, patient, deliberate care, led somewhere. People had always been unpredictable. Rules in every house I had lived in were subject to change without notice. Love had always come with a departure attached. But baking responded to precision. It did not have moods. It did not decide mid-process that you were too much. It asked for discipline and then, reliably, every single time, gave you something warm in return. I started taking every kitchen shift available. Around the same time, a guidance counselor named Vivian Brooks noticed something in the way I wrote about the future. She told me once, after reading an assignment, that she could see I didn't think about where I was going the way most kids did. She said, "You don't want to escape, you want to build." That sentence landed differently than most things adults said to me. It had nothing to do with my damage. It was about my direction. She helped me access a vocational program with culinary electives. Chef Ramon let me practice beyond the Saturday sessions. I woke before school to bake when I had access to a kitchen. When I didn't, I wrote recipes in the margins of old notebooks and memorized measurements the way other children memorized prayers, not because anyone told me to, but because it felt like the only kind of devotion that had ever returned something. By 16, I was helping cater small neighborhood events. By 17, Chef Ramon trusted me with the bread station without supervision. He told me once, "Talent makes noise. Discipline builds a life." Nobody in my biological family had ever offered me words like that. Nobody who shared my blood had stayed long enough to see who I was becoming. But two people with no obligation to me whatsoever had. An old baker with flour on his sleeves, a counselor who noticed where my eyes lit up. They were the first proof I had that being left behind was not the same as being meant to stay there. I filed that proof carefully. I intended to use it. I aged out of the system at 18 with one duffel bag, a folder full of paperwork nobody adequately explains until it is already too late, and a scholarship to a community college culinary program that felt almost embarrassingly small against the size of what I needed to prove. San Diego received me without ceremony. That was fine. I had never needed ceremony. I needed square footage and a working oven and enough quiet to think. I moved into a shared apartment with two women who asked nothing about my past and expected only that I pay rent on time and keep the sink clean. That was one of the first gifts adulthood gave me. Nobody required my gratitude for being allowed to remain. I enrolled in classes during the day. I worked mornings at a diner that served breakfast to people in work boots and hospital scrubs who smelled like exhaustion and purpose. At night, I cleaned equipment at a small bakery in North Park until my fingers went numb from hot water and sanitizer. I did homework at bus stops. I memorized ingredient costs while waiting tables. I lived on coffee, dry toast, and the particular kind of determination that, if you examine it too closely, is nearly indistinguishable from anger. I understood by then what most people learn much later, if they learn it at all. Stability is expensive. Peace is expensive. The ordinary things that people who grew up inside safe homes take as given, a consistent address, a phone plan, a winter coat that fits, all of it has a price. And when you begin with nothing, every single ordinary thing feels like a mountain with a bill attached to the summit. I started selling pastries at a weekend farmer's market, honey sea salt rolls, brown butter muffins, cardamom buns that sold out before 10 in the morning when the weather turned cold enough for people to want something warm to hold. At first, I was simply trying to cover textbooks and transportation. Then I noticed something that changed the calculation entirely. People came back, not out of obligation, not out of politeness. They came back because something I had made had stayed with them. They brought friends. They asked where my shop was. I didn't have one, not yet. But for the first time in my life, yet felt more powerful than never. The market was where I met Tessa Monroe. She had a booth nearby selling handmade ceramics and spoke faster than anyone I had ever encountered. She looked at my pricing board one morning and said, without softening it at all, "You're undercharging by at least 20% and smiling like that's a personality trait." I laughed, not because it wasn't a critique, but because it was delivered without any attempt to make me feel small in the process. That was rarer than it should have been. Tessa became my first real friend in adulthood, not a mentor, not a caseworker, not a professional with a clipboard and a legal obligation to check on me. A friend, the kind who arrived with coffee during a breakdown over rent and who could read a spreadsheet the way other people read gossip. Then there was Adrian Cole. He came into the bakery where I worked nights because his architecture firm was running late hours nearby. For a full week, he ordered the same black coffee and one plain croissant, like a man too tired to allow himself anything better. On the 8th day, he asked who made the orange rosemary scones. I said I did. He took one bite, closed his eyes, and went somewhere else entirely for a moment, standing in front of a pastry case at 11 at night in a flour-dusted room. I should have found it ridiculous. Instead, I laughed so hard I had to look away. Adrian was careful with people in a way that initially made me suspicious. Men who are genuinely gentle can feel implausible when your nervous system has been trained on instability. But he never pushed. He never tried to excavate my past before I was ready to offer it. He respected the pace I set without making me explain why I needed one. That patience made room for trust. Not quickly, not dramatically, slowly, which by then was the only kind of slowly I had learned to believe in. I transferred into a business-focused culinary extension program and began mapping something larger than surviving the next shift. Tessa kept reminding me I needed a brand, not just recipes. Adrian thought carefully about space and flow and the psychology of rooms people return to. Chef Ramon, who still called me kid even after I was legally an adult, reminded me not to chase aesthetics so hard I forgot substance. The name arrived quietly, the way the right things usually do. Second morning. Because some people receive one clean beginning, and some of us have to construct a second one entirely by hand. I started with pop-ups, then private catering for small events, then a breakfast window inside a shared food hall that barely accommodated 2 employees and a standing mixer, but which felt, in every meaningful sense, like proof of concept. I was frightened the entire time, not the paralyzing kind of fear, the clarifying kind, the kind that sharpens your attention and keeps you from becoming careless with what you have worked too hard to lose. The morning a local food blog described my cardamom buns as the finest baked thing to arrive in San Diego's brunch culture in years, I went to the dry storage room, closed the door, and cried for 5 full minutes with a bag of flour pressed under one arm. It was not about the review. It was about the distance between that moment and the girl on the plastic mattress who had once been told, in 100 different languages, that she was too much trouble to keep. By 27, I had opened my first full storefront: white tile, warm wood, open shelving. A long communal table at the center, because I wanted strangers to sit near each other and feel, even briefly, less alone. We hired 2 young adults aging out of foster care in the first year, not as a story, not as a press strategy, because I knew with absolute precision what it meant to enter adulthood without a single person in your corner who was there by choice rather than professional obligation. Business grew. So did the part of me that had stopped measuring worth by whether or not someone returned. By 32, Second Morning had become 8 locations across San Diego County, each one built around the same idea that had first steadied me in someone else's kitchen all those years ago: consistency, warmth, dignity, good bread, a room where no one has to earn the right to remain seated. Then I agreed to do a television interview. The anchor asked, near the end, where my commitment to second chances came from. Perhaps I was tired of carrying the answer alone. Perhaps some part of me had decided the truth deserved to exist somewhere outside my own body. I told her, not everything, but enough. I said I had been left in a children's home at 8 years old. I said I had moved through the foster system for the remainder of my childhood. I said the work I did now was built on the kind of support I had needed someone to fight to give me far earlier. The clip went online that evening. By the following morning, it had traveled far beyond the local segment it was meant to be. 3 days later, the calls began. The first voicemail arrived while I was reviewing payroll. I almost didn't listen to it, but I did. And the voice on the other end, deeper now, worn at the edges by time, was one I had not heard in over 2 decades and still recognized instantly. Because trauma does not store sound the way memory does. It stores it somewhere older, somewhere that logic cannot reach and time cannot fully clear. It was Owen. He said my name the way people say the name of something they are not certain still exists. He said there was a lot I didn't know. He said, "Please call back." I sat very still after the message ended. Still enough that my assistant manager knocked on the office door to check on me. I said I was fine. That was not entirely true, but it was functional, and functional had been my version of fine for most of my life. By evening, there were voicemails from Chloe, who cried before she finished saying my name. From my mother, whose voice had taken on a breathier quality, the sound of someone carrying regret in the chest rather than the mind. From my father, quieter than I remembered, slower. Then Owen again. Then my mother again. The texts arrived in varied tones, each one trying a different angle, like hands testing a locked door. "We need to talk. There is so much you were never told. Your father is not well. We never stopped thinking about you." I read each one. I did not respond to any of them. Instead, I forwarded the numbers to Tessa. Tessa has the instincts of someone who should have been an investigator, wrapped inside the professional composure of someone who runs operations across 8 locations without raising her voice. She didn't do anything that required explanation. She simply looked at public records, social media histories, local news archives, and the digital footprints people leave when their lives stop holding together neatly. By the end of the week, the picture was clear enough to make the timing of their sudden reappearance feel less like a coincidence and more like a calculation. My mother had remarried years after the divorce, then divorced again 18 months earlier. Her second husband had left after a prolonged period of financial difficulty she had kept hidden from almost everyone around her. My father had developed serious health issues and was living alone in a 1-bedroom rental outside Phoenix, working through what remained of savings that had not been managed carefully. Owen had been employed in regional sales until an expense fraud investigation ended that chapter abruptly. Chloe had spent years moving between both parents, had learned fragments of the truth about me at some point, and had quietly withdrawn from the family narrative in response. In other words, life had accomplished what conscience had not. It had cornered them. Suddenly, the daughter they had left behind was not a family shame to be managed with careful language. She was a door, and doors, when everything else has closed, begin to look remarkably like solutions. I want to be honest about what I felt when that picture became clear. Not ice, not the clean, controlled fury that makes for a satisfying story. What I felt was more complicated and considerably less cinematic. Rage, yes. Disgust at the timing, absolutely. But underneath both of those, persistent and humiliating and entirely indifferent to how successful I had become, grief. The old kind. The kind that does not care how many locations you operate or how many people recognize your name. The kind that notices, with quiet precision, how long it took for the people who made you to decide you were worth finding. I sat with that for several days before I responded. When I did, I set one condition: not their home, not Arizona, not a sentimental family dinner where the table setting could be used to imply that history was something you could simply rearrange. I told them to come to San Diego, to come after closing hours, to come to my flagship store. They called it neutral ground. It wasn't. It was mine. My ovens, my table, my staff gone home, my rules. The most important meeting of my life was going to take place inside the life I had built without a single one of them present. They arrived on a Tuesday evening, just after 7. I saw them through the front windows before I unlocked the door, and for one disorienting moment, they looked like an ordinary family, standing under the soft exterior light of a bakery, shifting their weight, waiting to be let in. Then I remembered what a family looks like when it actually wants to keep you, and the image dissolved. My father was smaller than memory had preserved him, not just thinner, diminished somehow, as though life had been slowly removing the infrastructure that once held him upright. My mother's hands were the same, restless, turning the strap of her purse the way they always had when she was managing something she didn't know how to say. Owen carried himself with the careful, deliberate politeness of a man who understands he is asking for something he has no right to request. Chloe looked at me the way people look at a grave they have finally found after years of not knowing where to stand. I let them in. No one moved to embrace me. Good. They sat at the long communal table, the same table where strangers shared pastries on Sunday mornings and left looking slightly less isolated than when they arrived. For a long moment, nobody knew how to begin. My mother said softly, "You look beautiful." It was such a perfectly useless sentence for that room. I said, "You didn't come here to describe my face. Start talking." They talked. Owen said there were things I hadn't understood as a child, that everyone had regrets, that time had a way of distorting what really happened. My father said he had been overwhelmed, ashamed, drinking too much, unable to see past the immediate crisis. My mother said she had been drowning and believed, genuinely believed, that temporary care was safer than the chaos she was living through. Chloe said she had been told so many different versions of my story over so many years that she had eventually stopped knowing which parts were real. I let them finish. Then I stood, walked behind the counter, and returned with 4 slim folders I had prepared the night before. Placement records, school transfer forms, caseworker notes, a birthday intake form with no emergency contact listed, aged-out paperwork with a single signature and no family present. I placed one in front of each of them. My hands were steady. That surprised me. "You keep using words like hard and overwhelmed and complicated," I said. "So let me simplify it. You did not lose me. You left me." Nobody moved. I told them about the window at Hope House, the parking lot I watched for months, the foster home where my clothes stayed in trash bags. I placed one in front of each of them. My hands were steady. That surprised me. "You keep using words like hard and overwhelmed and complicated," I said. "So let me simplify it. You did not lose me. You left me." Nobody moved. I told them about the window at Hope House, the parking lot I watched for months, the foster home where my clothes stayed in trash bags. I placed one in front of each of them. My hands were steady. That surprised me. The woman who whispered her particular brand of cruelty in private and received casserole compliments in public. The schools where I learned not to mention parents because pity made people awkward and the truth made them uncomfortable. The headaches, the insomnia, the years of apologizing for existing because somewhere along the way I had absorbed the idea that needing anything at all was a form of imposition. My mother began crying halfway through. I did not stop. I had waited too long to be interrupted by tears that should have arrived decades earlier. Then I told them about Chef Ramon, about Mrs. Brooks, about Tessa and Adrian, and the life assembled from scratch by people who had no blood obligation and no legal requirement to stay. I told them because I needed them to understand something that no amount of reframing would be able to soften. Strangers had done what family chose not to do. That was their indictment, not spoken as accusation, simply stated as fact. When I finished, silence settled over the room with real and measurable weight. Then my father said the thing he clearly believed would move me most. He said he was sick, that he didn't have much time, that he wanted to make things right before it was too late. My mother reached toward my hand, then stopped when I didn't move. Owen said, carefully, incrementally, testing each word before releasing it, that he had hoped, given everything I had built, there might be a way to help with their father's care, to help Owen himself after what he called one serious mistake, to perhaps consider what family could still mean, given time. The room changed in that moment, not because I was surprised. I had anticipated something like this from the first voicemail, but hearing it spoken aloud removed the last performance from the room and left only the mechanism beneath it, the need behind the nostalgia, the urgency inside the apology. They had not found me because love had finally outrun shame. They had found me because my success looked like shelter. I looked at each of them for a long moment before I spoke, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the particular clarity that arrives only after you have spent years learning the precise difference between what you owe people and what you have simply been conditioned to believe you owe them. I said, I did not build this life so the people who abandoned me could return and use it as a landing pad. My mother flinched. Chloe began saying she wasn't asking for money, only a chance, a conversation, some version of a beginning, however small. I believed part of that, perhaps most of it. She had been younger than the rest of them, more thoroughly deceived, more lied to across more years than I was comfortable dismissing entirely. She had not made the decision that morning in Hope House. She had been in the car. So I gave her the only softness I had remaining. I told her that perhaps, over time, there could be a conversation between the two of us. Slow, honest, without revision, without pressure, without anyone rewriting the edges of what had actually happened to make the room more comfortable. She nodded through tears. Even she understood that slow was more than any of them deserved. Then I turned to the others. I told my mother that thinking about me every day while doing nothing was not motherhood. I told my father that a deathbed apology was still late, meaningful perhaps, but late. I told Owen that being a child once had explained his silence, but that he had been a grown man for the majority of the years that silence continued. I told them I hoped they found good therapy. I hoped they learned to tell the truth without requiring an audience that would absolve them of it. I hoped they found a way to live with what they had done without asking me to carry the emotional weight of making them feel forgiven enough to sleep. Then I stated my terms plainly, without theater. I would not provide money. I would not fund medical care. I would not pose for a photograph that implied healing had occurred on a timeline convenient for anyone other than me. I would not allow them to move in and out of my life based on the cycle of their needs. Any future contact would begin in writing. Honesty would be the only currency accepted in any room I agreed to share with them. My father cried then, the quiet kind. The kind that surfaces when pride has finally exhausted its supply of useful defenses. My mother said she was sorry, repeatedly, until the words began to lose their shape and become something closer to collapse than language. Owen asked if there was anything they could do. I said yes. Tell the truth. Tell everyone who still believes the cleaner version of this story exactly what happened. Stop calling it a misunderstanding. Stop hiding behind the word temporary. Say it correctly for once. You left your daughter in care and built new lives around her absence. That is not a complicated sentence. It does not require softening. Live with it out loud. They stayed perhaps another 20 minutes. No one touched the coffee I had offered out of habit. When they left, I locked the door behind them and stood alone in the quiet of my own bakery. Lights low. The smell of tomorrow's dough cold fermenting in the walk-in. The faint hum of refrigeration units moving steadily beneath everything. The same sound that had been there all along. Adrian arrived 10 minutes later because Tessa had messaged him when the meeting began. He did not ask whether it had gone well. He understood enough not to frame it as something that could go well or badly. He simply opened his arms. I stepped into them. That was the end of the evening. It was not, as I said, the end entirely. There were follow-up emails, a letter from my mother, a shorter one from my father after a hospital visit. Chloe and I exchanged a careful handful of messages over the following months. Nothing hurried, nothing warm before it had earned the right to be warm, just truth finally being used for something other than delay. But the thing people want to call revenge had already happened. Not because they suffered, though in their own ways they had. Not because I made them hurt. I refused to soften what they had done, but I did not architect their pain. Their pain had arrived entirely on its own, through the ordinary mechanisms of lives that had not been lived carefully. The real thing, the one that mattered, the one I had been building without knowing that was what I was doing, was something quieter than revenge and more permanent. They saw exactly what I had become without them: the work, the respect, the chosen family, the purpose. The rooms full of people who came back not because they were obligated to, but because something I had made with my own hands had genuinely fed them. And they understood, sitting at my table, in my building, in my city, that none of it belonged to them. They were not part of the rebuilding. They were the conditions that made rebuilding necessary. That distinction, clean, unbothered, requiring no speech to deliver, was the only justice I had ever needed. These days, A portion of every quarterly profit from Second Morning funds housing assistance, emergency grants, and workforce training for young adults aging out of foster care. Not because the story needed a tidy final chapter, because no child should be required to become extraordinary simply to survive what the adults around her failed to do. Children remember who stayed. They remember who made excuses and who made decisions. They remember which adults protected them and which adults protected their own comfort and called it love. And when those children grow up, when they build something from the rubble of what was supposed to hold them, they deserve more than belated apologies. They deserve safety, dignity, the right to draw a boundary without being made to feel that their survival is somehow a cruelty to the people who abandoned them. The little girl I was still lives somewhere inside me. I don't ask her to move on faster than she is able. I don't silence her for other people's convenience. I listen to her. I protect her. I built a life wide enough and steady enough that she never has to sit beside another window, shoes still on past midnight, waiting for footsteps that were never coming. And if there is one thing worth carrying away from this story, it is simply this. Family is not proven by blood. Family is proven by who stays, when staying costs something, when nothing is guaranteed, when love is a choice made daily rather than a debt assumed at birth. The people who left me taught me what abandonment looks like. The people who stayed taught me what I was capable of becoming. I chose to build my life around the second lesson. That choice is mine. It belongs to no one else. And no phone call, however persistent, however carefully timed, will ever change that.